Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Sive, a guest with Sophie and Kelly on the Voter In segment of Two Broads. And welcome to this show. We're really excited about doing this. We're hoping that you'll find it interesting and valuable and inspirational. And most important, we're looking forward to sharing what we know and working together to make this dream of voting in our next woman president come true. So let your friends know, welcome, and let's get going. Thanks.
Are you listening?
Hello, everyone. This is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. I'm here with my co-host, Sophie. Hey, Sophie.
Hey, Kelly.
And we are joined today by our regular recurring guest, Rebecca Sive. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, good morning.
This is the second episode in what is going to be an ongoing series called Vote Her In. And the context we're talking about in this episode is kind of how do we get to the next big systemic breakthrough. So how do we get to electing a woman president? Where have we come from? There's a long history here. So we're going to talk through that today, but we're going to take a step back just for a moment to sort of recognize what happened in Chicago yesterday. So we are recording this on Wednesday, February 27th. Yesterday was the Chicago mayoral election, and we had a really historic election here. We had 14 people on the ballot to be the mayor of Chicago, and we are going to a runoff on April 2nd. In that runoff will be not just two women, but two African-American women. And this is really a just tremendous moment for Chicago. Rebecca, do you want to talk a little bit about that? You've been in Chicago and Chicago politics for a long time.
Well, I would first just like to say, and one of my friends said this to me this morning, you know, sometimes dreams do come true, right? And what she was pointing to is what you've just said, is the victory by not one, but two women of color, one of whom is going to run the third largest city in the country. And, you know, there are many things that are important about it, but one is that, you know, being the mayor of a city, regardless of size, but certainly of a city the size of Chicago, is all about the wise use of executive political power, right? Which is exactly what we're examining in this series. And so one of the interesting questions I think we'll be able to look at going forward as we watch the primary campaign and so on is, are there lessons to be taken from what happens in this mayoral election for what may be pertinent for the women running for president? So I think that's a big piece of this. I would just say one other thing on a personal note, that had you said to me when I started out in Chicago politics that this could be the case, it really is. It means more than I can even express clearly. And I think that, you know, while Tony and Lori may disagree on important things, they are in unity with the rest of us about how important this is and how careful we should be and how smart we should be about, you know, women who care. So it's just a very exciting time, and I think we're going to learn a lot that we can then apply to this other movement of ours.
I'd be interested to see statistics from this year about mayoral elections. We also have the possibility of having our first female mayor of Madison, Wisconsin. We had our primary election a couple weeks ago, and rather unexpectedly, it came down to the current incumbent mayor and a local female activist. And I don't think a whole lot of people expected her to make the top two, and so she hasn't. So we might actually have a female mayor. And I've heard a lot of other stories about women this year making their runoffs for mayor. And so I'm wondering if maybe we can see this as a continuation of the quote-unquote Year of the Woman in 2018, sort of continuing on to the executive level, at least in local politics.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's sort of to be seen. I think that the data so far, and we'll see how it rolls out in this year, as you say, is that women are around 20% of the mayors of cities over 30,000 in population. And at the moment, there's only one woman mayor of the 10 largest cities. So I think you're right. We're going to see a lot of progress this year, and we also have a long way to go to reach parity, which is, exactly what we're looking at with the presidential, right? Even if we elect a woman next year, we'll still have a long way to go and lots of opportunity for other women to run for office too.
Yeah, and I think to a point that Sophie makes often, it's worth noting that of the top 6 finishers of the 14 people who ran, 4 of the top 6 in Chicago were women, women of color, in fact, and only 1 of the top 6 was a white man. So Chicago, of course, does not equal the whole country, but this idea that white men are somehow more electable is, I think, being just turned on its head.
It's absolutely true. And, when I was looking at the history of the women who've run for president, as you both know, I know, but our listeners will hopefully learn more about Victoria Woolhull, who ran for the first time in 1872, the first woman to run for president. Her vice presidential candidate was Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist. Mm-hmm. So there's a great history of collaboration of women and people of color on this issue and on running for office when they really have something important to say, whether or not, at least in that circumstance, they had a reasonable expectation of winning, which of course they didn't, but Woodhull and Douglass stepped out. And then Woodhull stepped out again a couple more times. So it's, I think all of the women who ran for mayor had felt that they had an opportunity to make it, but even if their heart of hearts, they knew it was going to be tough, they had something they wanted to say, and I think that's a really important piece of this history, that the women who've had the courage to put themselves out there have been clear about a message and a platform.
So let's talk then a little bit about Victoria Woolhull and why did she run, and what was the message and the impact of her running for office so very long ago?
Yeah. It's really interesting because when I first heard about her when I was studying all of this in graduate school, she was known as a, quote, free love advocate, and she has a very interesting personal history that's kind of fun to read about. But when she ran as a suffragette. Of course, it was another, 50 years until American women got the right to vote. And she ran on the platform and for a party called the Equal Rights Party. So I think that, there's a really important message there about the continuity of women saying there ought to be equal rights. I'm going to advocate for them and put that out there. And I think that, obviously her willingness to run again a couple more times showed that, this was paramount in her mind. So she's really important both because she was the first person to do this. She was a sort of out-of-the-box person, and because she began this now historical tradition of advocating for equal rights. And, I would say just as a little footnote here, not so little, that not every suffragist at the time was keen on Woolhull. Apparently Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were not. But I think that also goes to the fact that the kind of women who have the courage to run for president are just that. They can take it, right? And they'll just keep on moving.
And it's kind of amazing when you think that she ran when women couldn't even vote. So exactly. She couldn't even count on, the votes of women who wanted to see themselves, represented at the federal level. That's kind of amazing to me.
Yeah, I think it was amazing to me, too, when I realized, it's a half a century until suffrage. But it's the power of these women and their willingness to step out, as I said. And the woman who ran next was Belva Lockwood, and she ran in, I think, 1884 for the first time, or 82. And she's a similar kind of courageous woman, a very different personal history, kind of a mainstream sort of person, a lawyer. She was the first woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court. But she, too, stepped out at a time when women couldn't vote, when property rights were problematic for women. And one of the really interesting things I learned when I was looking a little more closely at her biography was that after she ran for the presidency, and for too, but she became a particularly strong advocate of, pay equity and equal economic opportunity, which is, when you think about it, astounding, because it really wasn't until, almost 100 years later in the 1970s that various professions, including the law, really opened up to women.
And I know we have a lot of parents of young kids who listen to the podcast, and I just want to point out that there's a great kids book about Belva Lockwood. It's called A Lady Has the Floor, and it's written by Kate Hannigan, who is an author who's local to me. But it's a really beautiful book, and my kids really enjoy it, and so do I.
When I'm glad you mentioned it, because when I was doing research actually for the resources section of my book, Vote Her In, I had so much fun looking at all these children's books. I mean, everyone from Belva Lockwood to, Dolores Huerta to Sonia Sotomayor. I mean, there are now all these wonderful books that, parents can share with their children and, where these stories are told. So it's a sort of another wonderful thing that's happened recently. And I kind of think all part of what we're trying to do here, which is educate ourselves about what's really possible and how we can support other women. So I would tell you that also when I was doing this research, there's a sort of, if you look at the periods of women running for president, there's really two. One, this first one when Woolhull ran and Lockwood ran, and the third woman who ran before the 1960s was a woman named Gracie Allen, who was actually a comedian. And what's interesting about her is that the idea of running for president, because she's a comedian, she says that it was sort of a joke and that she ran on something she called the surprise party. This was in 1940, running against FDR, who won. But the thing that she apparently did was go around the country and actually talk about why she could be president and why she wanted to be president. It doesn't seem as though her, so to speak, platform was, deep in the way that the Woolhull one was or the Belva Lockwood one was. But this is in the, the era of, depending how old you are, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, a woman was out there in pop culture talking about a woman president. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's neat. And I think we see a lot of echoes of that today, not necessarily running for president themselves, but a lot of Hollywood actors and pop stars who are using their voice, using their platform to talk about politics. It's happening a lot really in the past 2 years. And saying, hey, you should vote for, there were a lot of them saying you should vote for Hillary Clinton. And I suspect we'll see a lot of that in 2020 as well. People sort of using their touring around the country or their award show platforms to talk about that.
And using their celebrity, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably one of the takeaways also from the Woolhull in particular, is that she really used her celebrity as this so-called free love advocate to, go to something that she cared a great deal about, which was, equality. I also think it's interesting when you think about it that, and it's different from today, and we'll be talking more about it, is that these women, Allen was, it was, the surprise party wasn't a real party, but the parties that Woolhull and Lockwood ran on were real parties, the Equal Rights Party, the National Women's Party. And there's a history there of the fact that it's easier for someone who's a minority or a woman to be able to run for office in one of those parties just because it's not the big party that needs the national support that the Democrats and the Republicans require, and it's sort of easier to make the case and get out there and say, I'm willing to do this. So there are obviously different points of view among people about whether, these smaller parties are important or whether they interfere with the process. I don't know that I have a point of view on it, but I think it's good for us to know, as people who care, that when there's this opportunity with smaller political parties, women have taken it. Mm-hmm. And that, as you and I, Kelly, have discussed, has extended into modern times as well.
Why do you think there was such a big gap in between Belva and Lockwood? and Gracie Allen. I'm assuming maybe it was the wars, but women's suffrage was really heating up at the turn of the 20th century, so I'm surprised there weren't more women running in between them.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think it in part lies in the fact that there were these smaller parties where there was an option to be a candidate. It's also true that there was an enormous effort by women who cared about public policy and civic leadership during that time to build other kinds of organizations, the League of Women Voters, all kinds of organizations that came into existence and provided a platform. And the other piece is what you mentioned, which is that the fight for suffrage was just so deep, and there were differences among the leaders of that fight about how to proceed, which of course, took up some of the oxygen. So I don't know that it's entirely clear, but I guess I would say, looking back, with the advantage of hindsight, that I'm kind of glad that these women spent the time they did on fighting for suffrage, because who knows how long it would have taken if they hadn't.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to save sort of the next section in history for the next episode. And Rebecca, can you talk a little bit about sort of why we've decided to break things up this way?
Well, when I was looking at the history, I realized that when Margaret Chase Smith, who's the next woman who ran for president, announced her candidacy in 1964, the country was really in a different place. And President Kennedy had been elected, and among other things, he appointed a commission that looked at issues related to women's rights. And of course, she was followed very quickly thereafter by Shirley Chisholm. So I think that, what we thought made sense was we would look at this really old history, this pre-suffrage history, and then we can take a look at, in our next episode, well, what's been this trajectory since 1964 when women have run for the presidency or sought the presidential nominations with the major parties? So I think that's where we'll focus, and that was kind of the thinking.
All right. And of course, we will continue to be looking at the Chicago mayoral race. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I'll be talking a lot about that on Facebook and Twitter if people want to check that out. I'm so excited about this race. And I think there's a lot of other races, a lot of mayoral races and things around the country that are going to be exciting. But, it's a good moment to be a Chicagoan.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that point, it's sort of a good moment to be a woman anywhere in this country who cares, going to the point that Sophie was making earlier, mm-hmm. About what happened in Madison. So onward and upward, right?
Absolutely. All right. Well, Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us again. This episode, of course, will be airing for the first time at the start of Women's History Month. So we have good timing yet again. And we're excited to keep going forward with this story.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to our conversation.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening, off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.